Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's lecture. Today we'll be focusing on parks and outdoor recreation as part of our Introduction to Forestry class. So, in order to start talking about recreation, let's come up with a simple definition for it. I think it's a term that a lot of people feel comfortable with, but then if you actually ask them to define it, they might struggle. So we're going to define outdoor recreation as activities outside of the home that offer contrast to work. So usually these are opportunities for constructive, restorative, or pleasurable experiences, and usually they're done in natural environments. Usually finding places to kind of get away from people and get away from the norms of daily life. So usually you get natural resource-based outdoor recreation. This can range anywhere from urban parks all the way to remote wilderness. And a lot of this involves public lands. So public lands being lands that are technically owned by the people, but they are managed and held in trust by the federal government. You also get state and local parks who own land, and you also have private lands as well. So this figure right here, or this table, is just some ideas of what qualifies as outdoor recreation. Because I think some people always think of recreation in terms of people being active, and sometimes it's not as active as people think, because things like family gatherings, picnicking, just taking a scenic drive, all of that still counts as outdoor recreation. It's that it offers a contrast from work. It's not something that you do normally. It's something that's different and done for pleasure. So there's a lot of different things that qualify under the idea of outdoor recreation. So some management goals for outdoor recreation, because really when we're talking about it, one of the things we've got to think about in terms of forestry is the idea that you're trying to manage outdoor recreation and you're trying to manage this land for the people. So how are we going to do that? So there's kind of three ideas that we want to focus on. So the first one is providing opportunities for healthy, safe, and positive recreation experiences by visitors to an outdoor setting. So basically what that comes down to is wanting it to be an enjoyable experience. If people are healthy, if they're safe, if they're feeling positive about their experience, then it was an enjoyable thing. So you're trying to do what you can to make an enjoyable experience for visitors. You want to develop a spectrum of recreational opportunities across different management and resource settings to provide for diverse activities and experiences by different types of user groups. And what that just basically means is that not everybody's the same, and not everybody wants to do the same thing. So going back to that list we were just looking at, there's so many different things that people do for recreation. And the more you can provide for all those different opportunities, the more popular your site will be. The least amount of opportunities you provide, probably the less people you're going to have. You might provide a great service though, like if you are running a place where all you do is provide for hunting. Well, that might be very popular for people who do hunting. It's not going to be popular for people who don't do hunting, but it still could be could be pretty good. Now, if you're a national forest and you offer mountain biking and hiking and scenic views and camping and trail running and canoeing and hunting and fishing and all of that, then all of a sudden now there's so many opportunities, you feel like it's going to be really easy to bring in a lot of people. Thirdly, we want to manage and monitor recreation while maintaining and protecting the health and sustainability of the natural environments. So really that idea now goes to looking at the land and being protective of the land and making sure that, yes, we want to allow people to recreate. Yes, we want to give people these great opportunities, but it cannot come at the expense of the environment. So, the value and benefits of recreation. I mean, there's a diverse amount of reasons. Some people just like to exercise. Some people like to have fun. Some people want to relax. Some people want to get out there with their family. Some people just need to change the pace. Some people just like to look at pretty things. Some people want to get to be alone. It's all sorts of different reasons. And sometimes it's multiple reasons. Sometimes it's people looking for all of those different experiences at different times in the same one experience. Another thing to really think about is this idea of direct participation and indirect participation. And so there's a lot to be said for just the idea of planning one of these trips and the anticipation of one of these trips and participation in these activities and just thinking about these activities after they're done. All of that is just as good sometimes as the activity, or not even better. So if you have direct participation, that's you doing all this stuff. But there's also indirect participation, like having your grandfather or somebody tell you about the first time they went fishing, or your grandmother telling you about the first time they went camping, or your parents talking about the first trip they took to Yosemite National Park. There's something to be said for just the idea of how valuable an experience can be, even indirectly, when you're not the one who went and did that. Lots of people read books on nature or books about people who went hiking or went on some sort of a journey. And so it's interesting how we can get pleasure or enjoyment out of the direct participation, but also out of the indirect participation, not even being there, but just being able to be brought into the experience. One example of this from my perspective currently is in another class. I've got an assignment where you have to go on a virtual hike. And so you've got it to where somebody else is in this place, but they've got a camera and they're taking you and showing you all the different beautiful things at this place, and you've got to experience it, experience what they show. And a lot of people found it to be fun, even though they weren't there, even though they weren't experiencing it for themselves. They still thought how beautiful the place was and how interesting it was, and all the different things that it made them think about, even though they were participating indirectly. So let's focus a little bit on some public lands to start out with. So the U.S. has 766 million acres of forest land. About 42% of that is publicly owned and available for recreation. So there's a lot of land. If you want to get out there and you want to go see nature and be in nature, there's plenty of it out there. And not only that, but for us specifically here in the Western United States, you've got about 90% of that land. So let's just use some rough numbers. Let's just say the U.S. has 800 million acres, right? If there's 40% of that, you're talking about, 300 million acres or so. And 90% of that's in the Western United States. So millions and millions and millions of acres of land out here ready for us whenever we want to use it. The eastern U.S. does have public lands, but they've got less public lands, but more visitors because people live much closer to those areas and are able to access them a lot easier. But you've got a much more established state park system and a lot of private land back east. A lot of the public land, like we said, is out west, 90% of it. Alaska does have the most public land in the U.S. However, it's very remote due to the location and limited access, so it doesn't see a lot of visitors, even though it's got a huge amount of public land. So the four agencies that we've really focused on before, those are still our four main agencies when it comes to public lands for recreation. These four federal agencies manage almost 94% of the public lands. And that's the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In terms of the national forests, the U.S. Forest Service, they manage the national forests and grasslands. So they have to manage under a multiple use and sustained yield doctrine. So the idea that recreation is one of those multiple uses, and when they're cutting down trees or when they're making a new trail or doing any of those things, that the ideas of recreation have to be thought about as they're coming up with these ideas. As a agency, the United States Forest Service receives more land-based outdoor recreational use than any other federal land, and that's also because there's so many of them. Fishing, hiking, hunting, camping, wilderness, rafting, ice and snow activities are kind of the main ones, but they also have trails set up for off-road vehicles, mountain biking, snowmobiling. There's also just regular roads for people taking scenic drives, and the National Forest Service has the nation's largest system of hiking trails. The Bureau of Land Management manages lands that we're going to call national resource lands, and those are defined as the land that the government is holding as land holdings. So the government basically purchased this land because of the value to us that it might have in terms of the minerals, in terms of oil, in terms of natural gas, all these other things that we might be able to get off of these lands. And that right now is somewhere 245 million, 247 million, about a tenth of the United States falls into these national resource lands that the Bureau of Land Management is managing. The majority of that land is available for recreation, and it's managed with the similar principles to the Forest Service of multiple use and sustained yield, and that's based off of the law from 1976 that matched up to the law in place for the Forest Service. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages national wildlife refuges. Those draw about 47 million visitors annually, and they're purely focused on wildlife-dependent recreation. So that comes down to things like hunting, fishing, wildlife viewing, environmental education, and interpretation. Those are the focused priority uses of national wildlife refuges. The National Park Service, their areas are national parks and national monuments. They have about 417 areas. They total 84 million acres, and it's in all 50 states and territories. And what falls under this category of national parks and monuments, it's the nation's outstanding natural, historical, and cultural resources. And they are protected and managed for educational and recreational use for future generations. So they are preservation focused. They exist only for educational and recreational use. They're not set up in that conservation effort. So that's really important to understand, going back to what we talked about in this class, the idea of preservation versus conservation. It's a much different focus for the national park. Consumptive uses are excluded in the national park. So hunting is banned. Fishing is allowed, but usually it's catch and release. And things like dogs aren't allowed in national parks, things that could disrupt the ecosystem. So they're really focused on protecting and managing for just education and recreation, very focused on preservation of these areas. What's also interesting about the National Park Service is that they administer the Department of the Interior's Special Recreation Assistant Programs, and they go for all federal agencies. So this Special Recreation Assistance Program is trying to obtain surplus properties and planning assistance and funding to state and local entities. There are two big ones that the book focuses on. It's the Land and Water Conservation Fund and the Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program. So the first one, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, it's the lands that they're trying to get must be funded to be maintained for recreation in perpetuity, and their goal is to try and stimulate non-federal and private investments in protection and maintenance of recreation resources. And then the Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program, their focus is the use and protection of important land and water resources outside of national parks and forests. So greenway areas, railed trail areas, basically the lands that connect to the national parks and national forests, knowing that it's all one ecosystem, knowing that everything connects to each other. They're trying to find those lands that are outside of the park and still make sure that they're being maintained the proper way so that that doesn't negatively influence what happens inside of the park or the forest. The table on the left here shows in 2012 how many visitors went and used each of the lands and how much money they spent, and so how much value added that is for an area, as well as the amount of jobs created for the recreation industry. And on the right, this is a table out of your book that kind of explains what we've talked about so far in terms of the public lands, in terms of the federal public lands, and then we'll go into state and local and private. So state lands, there's about around 70 million acres, so that's 9% of the forest land in the U.S. There's about 18 million acres in state parks and recreation and natural areas. Different types of uses that you get for state lands. You'll have parks, you'll have forests, you'll have wildlife and fish management areas, you'll have historic sites, and then there's other ones as well. One of my favorites is when I go and visit my niece and nephews up in Northern California, and there's just some state historic sites that we like to go hiking around. They're usually situated closer to densely populated areas. 40% of the state parks and 60% of the state forests are in the eastern U.S. and much closer and much more accessible to people. State forests tend to be less developed than federal forests, and the state parks usually offer more facilities and have easier access. State lands really vary greatly in size. You can have just really small areas. Some of the historic sites might only be a few acres, whereas the Adirondack Park and region in upstate New York, that's state lands that are 2.5 million acres. The big issue for state parks and kind of a lot of things when it comes to the forestry industry is just adequate funding for maintenance and operation. So as always, if you're following along with the slides here, you can pause right here, and I've linked up at the top left here just a video of some of the different offerings that they have in terms of the state park over in the Adirondacks. Really seems like an interesting area, somewhere I'd truly like to visit someday. And this is just the pictures here are just some different opportunities that people have took to recreate in terms of the Adirondacks. But one of the interesting things that I find is you'll see the video and it has this structure in it, and you have to really think about the idea of if you're going to build a structure like this, who is your target audience and how much use are you getting, because it's going to cost a good amount to make a structure like that. But if you have so many visitors and you have so many visitors of a certain age that this sort of a thing will really make your park attractive and even bring in more visitors, then it's totally worth it. But that's something really interesting to think about, and this this big park in the Adirondacks, even at state land, really takes some a lot of planning, takes some opportunities when they see them, and really tries to provide a great recreational experience for people. In contrast, here is a picture from Texas of Caprock Canyon State Park. And this is me and my dog Raleigh just hiking along a trail. And you can see, compared to the video if you watched it, or just compared to the pictures that I showed before. You should get kind of a different feel in terms of maintenance and upkeep and what you have going on. Here, much more just like, here's a trail, go figure it out sort of a thing, as opposed to, one of those pictures you saw, like the railings with the guide board, and then the other one you see that big huge structure. Slightly different feel here in this state park. Local public lands. So usually if you hear terms like municipal park and recreation agencies, or county park, or special park districts, those fall under this idea of local public lands. They can be parks, they can be forest preserves, they can be greenways, they can be auto parks, they can be arboretums, beaches, zoos, aquariums, herbariums, all sorts of other things. Usually, local parks or local public lands are day use oriented because they're local, so they're close by. So they're really assuming that their base of public is going to be the people that are close by. One of the easiest examples to think about for people is Central Park in New York. That would easily fall under this idea of local public lands. For us, Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, that's one that would fall under local public lands. But I think for us here, the one that I really think of, or the one that comes to mind for me, is Panorama Park, right outside of Bakersfield College. And you can walk right off the campus, cross the street, and be right into Panorama Park, overlooking the Kern oil fields and the Panorama Vista Preserve. Private lands. Private lands really can differ from our public lands because they provide a full spectrum of land resources for recreation. Pretty much 60% of all the campgrounds in the U.S. are on private lands. Some private lands can either be run by the owner, or they can be run by a conservation group like the Nature Conservancy or the Conservancy Fund, or some sort of a local land trust. Private lands usually try and make some money. If it's run by a owner, usually they'll take leases for hunting and fishing as an additional source of income. And then also private industrial forest lands of the southern U.S. are usually available for recreation as well. A good example of private lands in this area is Southern California Edison. The utility company, they've bought up some land, but their land is available for people to go out and recreate and ride off-road vehicles, or just go hiking. And I think they might have hunting and fishing permits. I think it's really site dependent, but they've got a few different public land offerings, and they're doing some forest work on them. Here's another link to a private ranch in Hawaii, on the island of Kauai, where my wife and I went on our honeymoon, and we were able to go and experience some private land and the different things that they have. What's interesting about this place is we got to ride off-road vehicles, and a lot of movies are shot here. So some scenes from Jurassic Park and Jumanji and Indiana Jones, a lot of different things have been shot at this place. So I mean, there's all sorts of different experiences you can get on public lands, and that's, I think, what really is the big difference between public lands and private lands, is that the idea that public lands, they want to offer a lot of diversity, but they might be limited to where they are and what they can offer. Whereas private lands you can offer the full spectrum. You can give people everything that they want, because ultimately it's public lands. You just kind of hope that everybody, whether it's public or private, is doing their best to make sure that the land is being kept up well and that the environment's being protected. So we're going to focus now on, for just a little bit, on the idea of outdoor recreation participation trends. So one of the real things that you want to think about in terms of why should we focus on the trends in recreation is that you're trying to predict participation. And that's important because you really want to understand what the land is going to go through. So with the environment, you want to be ahead of the curve. You want to be able to protect the land. You don't want to try and figure out how to fix the land once a problem's already happened. You want to stop that problem from happening in the first place. So it's important to understand the trends in recreation and see where it's going to really make sure we kind of stay ahead of the curve and stay on top of the game in order to make sure that the land can be protected. And why is that really important? Because 95% of Americans enjoy some form of recreation. So if we say America's 330 million people, we're talking over 300 million people are out there recreating. So if that's the case, we really, really want to make sure that the land is being protected. Cordell and others did a study in 2009, and they saw large increases in walking, visiting nature centers, attending sporting events, picnicking, and sightseeing. They saw decreases in activities like tennis, ice skating, cross-country skiing, and sailing. And they believe this reflects socioeconomic changes and shifting activity preferences. So you're seeing a lot more of just kind of basic getting outside things, walking, finding a nature center, eating outside, sightseeing, just looking around, seeing much bigger increases in kind of just basic outdoor activities. Here is a table from that study, and so you can take a look at that and kind of see where you see increases and then where you see decreases. Like at the bottom there, you see that there's very little increase in water skiing, but at the top there, you see a huge increase in walking for pleasure, and huge increase in day hiking, and huge increase in viewing or photographing birds. So let's talk about the idea of how we're going to manage outdoor recreation. If I was to get a job and go work at a national park or get an internship at a national forest, what are the types of things that I would be thinking about? So we're going to focus first on 5 key management concepts. So quality, diversity, managing change, having clear and measurable objectives, and protecting the user's freedom of choice. Those are 5 pretty easy to understand concepts. Quality, the quality of the experience, the quality of the land, making sure everything is just up to par. Diversity, being able to have freedom of choice and a lot of different things that people can do. We want to be able to manage change because we know landscapes are dynamic, and if they're dynamic, they're going to be either constantly getting better or constantly getting worse or bouncing back and forth, and we need to be prepared for that. Having clear and measurable objectives of how we're going to manage the land and what we expect from the land and the visitors, and then protecting the user's freedom of choice, making sure people are allowed to be able to be out there, make their own decisions without hurting themselves, others, or the land. So we're going to have a conceptual framework. In order to do this, there's 3 pieces to the conceptual framework. So there's going to be the recreational opportunity spectrum, or the ROS, the recreational carrying capacity and the limits of acceptable change, or the LAC, and then the interagency visitor use management framework. So the recreational opportunity spectrum, or the ROS, that's a planning framework that recognizes the full spectrum of recreational opportunities. So you're going all the way from the idea of paved urban settings to primitive wilderness where there's nothing available. So, toilets and parking lots and signs and all sorts of stuff to here is just nature. You figure it out. The activities will differ physically, biologically, socially, and then the managing of the land. And it's all for the basic understanding that we've got to provide a diversity of opportunities. The ROS is going to assist in identifying an area's capability and potential. You want to match up your area with the visitor's needs and preferences. And then you also want to develop recreational management prescriptions and strategies to utilize and protect the different kinds of opportunities that may be available at the place you're working. And so on the left here in this figure, we have our recreation opportunity spectrum. So it might be an activity, an experience. You might want to choose something just based on the setting. We've got all of our different choices from urban all the way to primitive. They all need to go into our management planning, and then they're either going to come out in our management prescriptions or our project planning. And then on the right here, you can see that we get increased use and increased development as we go from primitive over to recreation in a much more urban setting. The recreational carrying capacity is the maximum amount and type of use that an area can tolerate before the quality of the recreation resource and its particular experiences deteriorate beyond an acceptable level. And so we can have three types of recreational carrying capacity. One might be ecological, so just resource limitations on what the area can hold. It might be social in terms of visitor tolerance for congestion. So the idea that a place becomes so crowded, people are like, forget it, I don't want to go there. If you've ever tried to get to Yosemite National Park on a Saturday morning, if you wait till 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock in the morning, you'll experience this where you get backed up like 40 minutes just trying to get into the park. You're not even into the park and you're waiting in a line of cars for an hour. And then another carrying capacity you might have is just the idea of physical and design. So making sure that depending on your site size, what limitations you might have in terms of facilities or what you can do at a place. Going back to that example from earlier, the Adirondack State Park, they were able to build that huge structure out there because they got a huge amount of land. But you can't build that sort of a structure everywhere if you don't have that land, you don't have the amount of people coming there, or the land itself can't have it. Then you'd be hitting that physical, social, and ecological carrying capacity. In terms of limits of acceptable change, or LAC, when we're talking about change, we're usually talking about environmental change and social change. They're natural, they're inevitable, and they are a consequence of recreation use. And what you're really thinking about with limits of acceptable change is just how much change is acceptable. How much are we willing to allow this land to go a certain way? Kind of taking that a little bit deeper, if we know that recreation is going to cause a little bit of damage to the land. If we make trails, we're getting rid of some vegetation. If the trail gets used a lot, it's going to cause some soil erosion. But what is our limit of acceptable change? Like, how much soil erosion are we willing to accept before we need to go and do something about it? So our focus is on managing for desired conditions, not for the number of visitors. And we want to focus on the idea of change, looking at the future and thinking about conservation. So yes, I know there's going to be soil erosion because on this trail, but if I can make sure to keep people on the trail and just take the trail through this one specific area, then that won't be so bad for the environment. But if it's this trail and 30 other trails, maybe that will be too much for the land to handle. And then maybe, though, if I get so much traffic on that one trail that it's really hurting the rest of the land, maybe then I need to think about creating an alternate trail or creating another trail going off of that to decrease the pressure off of that one trail. But those are all the different things that I want to think about. And then how much change am I willing to take, and how much how does that affect my management, and how does that affect my idea behind my desired conditions that I'm looking for. The third part of our conceptual framework was created in 2016, and it's the Interagency Visitor Use Management Framework. And it provides cohesive guidance for managing recreation use on federal lands and waters. It should apply to all conditions and all agencies in terms of recreation. The planning process is then incorporated into existing federal agency planning and decision-making processes. And it's got similar ideas to limits of acceptable change in terms of focusing on managing for the desired conditions, but they're going to do it by monitoring change in conditions and visitor experiences. It wants to be proactive, not reactive, and the one difference, though, between that and limits of acceptable change is that it does specify visitor capacities as part of the planning process, because it's going to make the assumption that these lands are popular and places that people want to go, and therefore we want to have visitors. We just want to make sure that it's managed correctly. And here is the example of the Interagency Visitor Use Management Framework. And so you can see they have a why, a what, a how, and a do. So they're going to build the foundation. They're going to define visitor use management direction. They're going to identify management strategies, and then they're going to implement, monitor, evaluate, and adjust from there. And so kind of the last thing we'll focus on in terms of parks and outdoor recreation is the idea of visitor management, because land is already hard enough to deal with, but then you add in people. And hopefully you're adding in careful people, but maybe you're not. Maybe the people are quite difficult to deal with. It really, sometimes it just depends on the people. So when we're talking about visitor management, we're concerned with enhancing visitor opportunities, experience, and satisfaction, but the resource protection must also be in balance with that idea. And so here we're also going to see direct and indirect ideas. So when we've got direct ideas in terms of visitor management, we're enforcing regulations. We're telling people what has to happen. Indirectly, it's less intrusive, and we're trying to influence rather than force the behavior. So you're going to see things like signs or guides to tell you what to do, but we're not going to force you to do it. Whereas banning use or limiting use are ways of enforcing regulations where it's direct management. So there's some different approaches. So there's interpretation, dispersing use, site management, and limiting and banning use and activities. And you can see on the left here in the figure how it goes from indirect to direct in terms of those approaches. So the first approach is interpretation, which is very much indirect visitor management. You're trying to inform visitors about appropriate ways to appreciate and use recreational resources, as well as ways to interact with nature. And other forms of interpretation might be safety education, and you can see on the right here the signpost there, and then down below here an interpretive ranger working at the national park, kind of showing people, this is what a bear looks like, this is a bear skull, those sorts of things, trying to teach you about the animals, trying to teach you about the place that you're at, really, but indirect management. They're not saying don't do this. They're just saying, hey, if you're going to the park, this is some information you might want to know. Another approach is to disperse use. So it's used to alleviate social problems in terms of congestion and crowding. You see this a lot at national parks. And so down below here, I've attached, or I've linked up the plan for, that Yosemite Park uses for Half Dome in terms of its congestion. as well as another link on Half Dome and just its popularity and how you've got to use a lottery system because there's so many people who want to go up there and hike and have that experience. You can also see dispersing use used in areas where hunting and fishing are popular. One easy way that people encourage dispersing use is if you'll hear terms like off season or weekday use only, or they'll offer up maps of visitor concentration areas so that you can see where a lot of people would go, and maybe you're the type of person that wants to go somewhere else. The big drawback is that you could increase total biophysical impacts in an area. So what does that mean? Well, if we have an area and it only has like one main trail, and we keep everybody to that main trail so that all the rest of the park, stays natural and stays an area where the wildlife and the plants are comfortable. Now all of a sudden, if I have so many people on that one trail that area is degrading, well, now I'll just spread it out. I'll make a few more trails. Well, that means that now there's people all over these areas instead of just concentrated on this one trail. Now maybe you have a trail here and a trail here and a trail going up there and a trail going back here. And now all of a sudden people are all over the place and much more spread out. So you could have much more in terms of your impact on the area total. And so here's a couple maps. On the left here, this is the Prime Hook National Wildlife Refuge, and you can see how they're separating their areas in terms of they show, okay, that's a no hunting zone, and then these other ones are hunting zones, and so they're going to spread people out to where they have to be in a specific zone. Same thing on the right here. This is North Dakota Game and Fish Department for deer gun hunts. And so you'll be, if you're hunting in this area, they will give you a specific hunting unit, and you've got to hunt within that unit. And then that way everybody gets an area and they're spread out, and that allows for this dispersed use where you're not getting, or hopefully not getting, a lot of congestion. Site management. This one is in the middle of the spectrum between direct and indirect, because sometimes it can be direct and sometimes it's indirect. One easy thing to think about is adding facilities or conveniences. So does this place need parking lots? Does it need a visitor center? Does it need restrooms? Does it need a restaurant or a snack shack sort of a thing? Hardening of sites, what are we talking about? Concrete, right? As opposed to just here, let me put a little lean-to area where people can get some shade and grab a map and read a sign, or here is a big, huge 10-acre visitor center with flat screen TVs and bathrooms, and or here's a hotel. In the case of Yosemite Park, Yosemite National Park has a hotel in it. So I mean, it really just depends. There's also national quality standards that these places have to meet. So they have health and cleanliness standards, especially if it's a public land. You'll have public service standards for cleaning. And really with your site management, you're looking at your setting, you're looking at the safety and security of your visitors, you're looking at the responsiveness that you might need in order to be able to reach people, and you're looking at the condition of the facilities that you have or that the site might require. And so some examples here on the left, you'll see this is a bulletin from the U.S. Forest Service about how they clean their recreational sites. And then on the right here, just this idea of the sign up says no cutting trees and day use only. And if you see a crime, report it here. So the ideas of kind of direct management and indirect management all at the same time. in terms of limiting or banning use, you can put limits on all sorts of things. The length of stay, in terms of if people were camping, you might have seasonal limits. So this is what can happen in the winter, but once it's not winter, don't do this anymore. Like, going out and playing ice hockey. Not going to work when it's the middle of summer in some places. It might work in the middle of summer in some places, but some places it won't. Restricting activities in certain areas, like this area is the hunting area, this is the no hunting area. Having consumptive removal limits, so bag limits for hunting, like you can only get 1 male deer this year, or you can only take 3 ducks when you go duck hunting. This is usually direct visitor management. Sometimes law enforcement's involved, and sometimes you have quotas or requests that can be involved in terms of making sure it's limited. So in terms of a request, when I was in the Southeast, they'd have some special days for hunting where it was just kids could hunt on the day, and sometimes it was like people with special needs to make it to where they were able to have that experience. When we're talking about bans, we're usually talking about trying to keep people from either hurting the environment or hurting themselves. So fire danger is the most common one, where you see a sign, it says, this is the fire danger, so no campfires, and be, really responsible, no fireworks, that sort of a thing. Animal-human interactions, like don't go on this trail because there's a bear there. Campsite degradation, pollution, any problems with that, they'll close up an area. Here's an example of Kentucky, and how Kentucky does their deer hunts, and how they have their public lands, and they have quotas. So they have a quota draw and a quota application, to where you can see, like, for this Ballard WMA at the top there were 950 people who applied, but only 100 people were able to get to go hunting in that area. And so that way we're going to limit use and really make sure that it's that we're doing our best to not overrun these areas and not degrade the environment. In terms of a ban, I believe it was last summer at Lake Isabella, they found blue algae at the lake, and so they banned people from, or they really wanted to ban people from going in the water. They still kind of let you, but they told you, do not eat shellfish from this water, do not drink this water or use it for cooking, do not let your pets and animals go in there. And they say, you can go swim if you want, but stay away from the algae. And so there's some of that right there where it's like, here's a limit, right? You can go swimming, but stay away from this stuff. And then there's also the ban. Do not eat shellfish. Do not use this water for cooking or drink this water, because they're trying to keep people from being hurt. And that's it. That's kind of the basics of parks and outdoor recreation. If you want to know more, we here at BC offer a outdoor recreation management class. So if you're interested in this sort of a thing, I would say follow up and take that class and see where it gets you.